We are going, we're going to get started. I want to welcome you all to a topic that is meaningful, I know, to everyone in this room. And let me just introduce myself first. I'm Rabbi Weinstein. This is probably the first public venue that I've got that I'm able to announce myself as the CEO Emerita of JWI, Jewish Women International. My boss is sitting over in the back, Meredith Jacobs, our new CEO, as well our former board chair, Susan Turnbull. So I'm so happy to be here at what I think is such a meaningful moment in the work that we are doing in communities and nationally to address the issue of gun violence and the intersectionality around so many things that affect the Jewish community. So let me start with just a short introduction, and then I'll introduce our panelists, and then we will move into a conversation where I will ask each of them questions for both to ask, and then I'm going to really hone in on their specific area of expertise and ask questions that are related to that lens of expertise. Following the questions, we are going to have about 15 minutes of Q&A, and I really hope people will be thinking about questions that are meaningful for their community, questions that really will help advance the coalition building and the work going forward. So I often ask this question when I'm starting a conversation, which is, how many people do you think died of gun violence last year in this country? And we don't have time to go around and answer that question, but it is almost 40,000 people. 40,000. That's 39,000 people who lost their lives. And just for a moment, in this country, the United States of America, let's let that number sink in. It's more than 100 people a day who lose their lives from gun violence in this country, senselessly, needlessly, and without the protections that are so essential to stop this. This number doesn't even speak to the lives that are forever altered due to the injury or loss of a loved one, nor does it capture the 1 million American women who have been shot at by an intimate partner. While we know that no person nor people are or is safe from violence, our community, with the rise of anti-Semitism and the recent mass shootings in Pittsburgh and Poway, is on high alert. So today we're here, and we all know that we've got to mobilize our communities and advocate for gun violence prevention reform at both the state and local level. We know that while no single policy will stop all gun violence, there is so much that we can do. At JWI, we are helping to spearhead the effort to close the boyfriend loophole, so that finally, boyfriends who are convicted of abusing their partners are treated the same as husbands who are convicted of abusing their partners and are banned from having guns. And today we will hear from this expert panel about legislation that will close other loopholes and stop people who may be a danger to themselves and to others from having guns, and to ban weapons of war in our streets. It really is up to all of us. If our elected leaders don't feel pressured and continually pressured, they will never pass meaningful, common sense measures to reduce mass shootings, suicides, domestic violence, homicides, etc. So today we will hear from two very esteemed panelists, Rob Wilcox of Everytown for Gun Safety and Lori Haas from the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. I know that many of you believed that we would be hearing from Rabbi Susan Shankman as well, who is the rabbi at Washington Hebrew and very involved in this work around the Washington, D.C. community. Unfortunately, Rabbi Shankman had a death in her congregation and is with the family this afternoon. But I think between Rob and Lori and myself, we will try to fill the spaces that I know Rabbi Shankman is so knowledgeable and involved in. But our goal today is really to provide you with the first-hand knowledge about federal and state legislation and policy changes that are currently underway. Also to learn more about coalitions that are successfully working together and local clergy initiatives that offer opportunity for partnership and policy revision so that you can build support for the legislation in your very communities. There's so much happening at the state level right now, and nobody can be a better spokesperson for what is going on nationally that is emblematic of what we can do to turn things around than Lori talking about what's happening in Virginia. I also want to remind you that those of you who will be participating in the resolution session tomorrow night, there is an updated gun violence prevention resolution that will be voted on by JCPA at this session. I really urge you all to make sure that you're there and that you vote on this. Let me quickly introduce you to our wonderful panelists and then we'll get started. Lori Haas is the Senior Director of Advocacy at the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. She's worked for the coalition since November 2009 and plays a crucial role in the Commonwealth of Virginia's work to advance policy, legislation, community, and grassroots efforts to reduce gun violence. Following the 2007 Virginia Tech massacre, in which Lori's daughter was shot twice and survived, she became personally involved in gun violence prevention efforts and is the voice of gun violence prevention in Virginia. She regularly works with the Virginia congressional delegation in Washington and lobbies extensively in the Virginia General Assembly, where there is so much happening. Lori is a leader of the GVP movement in Virginia, working with a wide array of constituencies to advance policies and programs that reduce gun violence. And Rob Wilcox, sitting next to me, is the Deputy Director of Policy and Strategy for Everytown for Gun Safety. Rob has worked for Everytown for Gun Safety for over 4 years in a variety of capacities, and prior to that, he was the staff attorney with the Legal Action Project at the Brady Center to prevent gun violence. There are so many marvelous groups that have really dedicated their organizational power and resources to this movement. Rob's practice focuses on reforming the gun industry through civil actions brought on behalf of victims of gun violence. He represented victims across the country, including a number of law enforcement officers that were shot or killed in the line of duty. Rob is also involved in defending gun laws from Second Amendment challenges, a very important strategy that requires all of us to put our best selves and most knowledgeable selves forward. Rob actively participates in conferences and forums related to his work on gun violence prevention, and he too has a personal story, becoming involved in gun violence prevention in 2001 after losing his cousin Laura. I'm going to begin today by asking each of them a question, and then we will turn to some more focused questions. So for both of you, and I think Lori's going to tackle this first, there are many important legislative fixes to address the gun violence epidemic in our country, and they're occurring at the federal and state level. For many, it's challenging to prioritize what we undertake in the short term and what issues we defer to a time when the politics of gun violence prevention are not as volatile as they are today. So I want to start off by asking each of you, what are your and your organization's top priorities for 2020? And looking ahead to those bigger, bolder goals, what do you hope to tackle in the coming years?
Good afternoon, thanks for having me. I'm lucky to work for 2 organizations. I always forget to share that with people who have invited me to speak. The Coalition to Stop Gun Violence is a C4 and allows me to do a lot of advocacy work, a lot of lobbying, a lot of messaging, a lot of what some people call political work. It's, I think it's more encompassing than just that. I also work for the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence, our C3, which is our sister organization, which we consider a public health think tank. So I can look very, very smart because I have a bunch of colleagues with a lot of letters after their names doing a lot of research and a lot of data. We at the Coalition and the Ed Fund develop evidence-based solutions to reduce gun injury and gun death in all their forms. We work extensively on suicide, firearm suicide prevention, lethal means, counseling, interventions, understanding where that intersection is and how lethal a firearm is as a chosen method for suicide. And then we also work on homicides, firearm homicides, and then we also work at the community level very, very granularly. We know that too many deaths occur in communities that have suffered from systemic racism, frankly, for generations. That puts them at a socioeconomic disadvantage, which just fosters a landscape where violence is happening far, far too often. And that violence becomes deadly with the easy access to firearms. So it's not one or the other. You have this community work going on at the same time you have the policy work to reduce access to firearms. So, our goals for 2020 remain the same regardless of the year. We want to work on gun violence in all its forms. Specifically for me, 2020 is a very big year in Virginia. The General Assembly is ongoing right now. We have numerous bills we're following. It's exciting, difficult, and nerve-wracking all at the same time. We have an assault weapons ban that's advancing. It's on first read today. It's on second reading on Monday and third reading on Tuesday, and we are precariously at 51 votes. I've got to keep all 51 of those in line. So specifically for me, that's a big goal, is to get through 2020. We also work with a wide array of constituents. Faith groups, public health groups, legislators, law enforcement, groups on the ground, just everyday citizens who want to be active and stay involved. So again, for us, it's not an either or, it's an all of the above, but we do a lot of data research. Take that research, translate it into policy, and then work to move that policy forward. And I want to talk about the extreme risk clause at some point, but maybe I'll defer to Rob and let him talk about his priorities first, and then I'll go there later.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Everytown for Gun Safety felt honored to be invited to speak at this important conference, and I'm privileged to be here myself and with both Lori's, who bring expertise and passion to this issue. Lori Haas in particular has always been a hero since she has taken a tragedy and worked nonstop in a state that was often unfriendly to get to the point now where you're potentially on the third read of an assault weapons bill. So I'm really honored to be here with you. Everytown for Gun Safety is kind of an umbrella organization. We have devoted significant people power and resources to studying gun violence and different tools for prevention. We put out a lot of research reports and interactive data visualizations to get a better understanding of gun violence in our communities. And then on the advocacy side, we have about 6 million supporters who we routinely offer different levels of engagement, from sending an email to showing up to an advocacy day to making a phone call. And we try to provide a wide variety of ways to engage, because frankly, I think that's pretty key when you're activating large groups of people, is give them ways to activate that can fit their potential interests and their potential abilities. Not everyone can get to an advocacy day at their state capitol, but we've designed virtual phone banks so that you can call into places that need to be activated so you can make phone calls to legislators. And so we're constantly activating those members, as well as Moms Demand Action volunteers, where we have volunteer chapters in all 50 states, and the Everytown Survivor Network, which is a group of survivors that we provide the tools to become advocates on. And I think when you look at that kind of breadth of work, that's really the engine that drives our organization, is centering survivors of gun violence, empowering volunteers to take action, and giving them the kind of advocacy tools to be successful. The question about the priorities, I think, is a really good one, because there's so much happening in this country on so many different fronts that I kind of boiled down to 3 things that we're working on this year. And one is we got to keep fighting for some of the work that started last year. The gun, having a gun sense majority in the House and the leadership of Speaker Pelosi allowed us to see gun legislation pass for the first time in 20 years. And there's bills sitting on Majority Leader McConnell's desk that he hasn't acted on. And so we plan to keep up the pressure. And those bills include a bill that would require a background check on all gun sales. And why is that important? It's an important foundation to every single gun law we talk about. If you think that someone shouldn't have a gun, well then you need to create a process to stop them from having one. And background checks have been in place since 1993. They've blocked 3.5 million people, but they only are required when at licensed gun stores. So individuals can meet at gun shows or online, and they can exchange firearms without a background check. And there's just kind of some research I want to give you, because you got to ask yourself, is that a problem? How big is the problem? We took a look at this one website, armslist.com. In 1 year, there was 1.2 million ads for firearms that didn't require a background check. Lori's looking to close that loophole, and in Virginia there was 50,000 ads. And so that's a significant advancement for public safety, right? So that's a lot of ads. Now you got to ask, are there people trying to buy guns? Well, we placed ads so we can get information about who was trying to buy them, and we found that 1 in 9 people looking to buy guns from unlicensed sellers, where there'd be no background check, would fail a check. And that's an undercount, right? Because we could only access publicly available databases. The final question is, do passing laws matter? Absolutely they do. We took a look at states that had closed these loopholes, like Lori's about to do in Virginia, to see how these unlicensed sellers operated online. And we took a look at states that hadn't. In states that had not closed this loophole, less than 5% of these sellers would say to a potential buyer, we have to do a background check. In states that have, 84% of sellers were saying we got to do a background check. I've listened to these calls, I've read the transcripts. What was amazing was just how routine it was. These sellers would say, oh, we just have to meet at a gun store. There's 5 around here. I mean, that is how we change culture. It's how we change outcomes. The other thing that's sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk, as Lori mentioned, is a bill to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act that would close the boyfriend loophole. I'll allow you to speak to that later because you're such leaders on this, but it is an incredibly important issue because it shouldn't matter if a domestic abuser has a ring on their finger. What should matter if they have a gun in their hand? And we can get into some more of that later. The second thing is the extremist protection orders. And we're working really hard on a federal bill that we want to pass in the House and in the Senate that would provide money to states that have passed these laws and set up a federal system so that anyone in any state can go and get one of these life-saving orders.
Can you talk about that a little bit more for people who may not be?
Briefly, in Lori's organization, we're true leaders in thinking about this type of policy, bringing together experts. And my aunt and uncle have been advocating for it since the death of my cousin. And so to give you an example of this story, it's the individual who killed my cousin was dangerous, and he was in crisis. And people knew, and they knew he had guns. His brother was a deputy sheriff. And they tried to commit him to be involuntarily committed because of his crises, and he didn't meet that standard. And basically no one knew what else to do. They knew he shouldn't have guns, they didn't know how to get rid of them because he wasn't giving them up. And so one day he took those guns and went into the mental health hospital where my cousin was volunteering a winter break from Haverford College, and he shot and killed her. And he shot and killed 3 other people that day. And this kind of law, though, that Lori's organization really helped bring awareness and expertise to would create a process where you could go to court to provide evidence that someone is a danger to themselves or others by their behavior, the threats they're making, the conduct they've made, and you can get an order that will temporarily restrict their access to firearms. For most states, it's up to a year. 17 states have passed these laws. You need to, 18 soon with Lori's work. You need to raise awareness, and you do that with federal dollars, and you need to have every federal court open to this. The last thing for 2020 that's essential are elections. And we know in the Virginia elections that just happened, gun safety was a top issue. In our polling of battleground states, we know that it's the third issue. It's the number 3 issue. When people are asked, if you don't share this position, can I support you? And the third issue that people talk about is whether or not this candidate supports background checks. And so with elections, especially in the C3 context, it's about raising awareness of these issues and finding out where candidates stand so that those in your congregations, those in our communities can make informed judgments on voting day. Going forward, I'm really looking forward to, I think, the strengthened conversation that's going to be happening the rest of this year, but really in 2021 and going forward at the national level around gun suicide. And there's a number of bills we're working on there, addressing city gun violence by both looking at the interventions that Lori mentioned at the community level, but also holding a gun industry accountable that is intent on profiteering with no regard for public safety. And the kind of last piece that I think is really, I'm looking forward to, not because it is a proactive solution, because it's going to expose the NRA and the gun rights lobbyists who've been trading in extremism. And they trade in misogyny, white supremacy, and anti-Semitism. I think about this one meme that was sent around this community, and it said, these are the gun control supporters, and it had pictures of different people from the movement, and they had Israeli flags, because they just picked the people who were Jewish. And that needs to be exposed, and I think it is about to be exposed, and that will diminish their power and allow us to do some of the things that we want to be able to do.
Thanks. Lori, did you want to add anything to that, especially with respect to the extreme risk laws?
Yeah. Just that the extreme risk laws are narrowly drafted, narrowly applied, and narrowly focused for a good reason. Think about it, after these mass shootings, people question, how did this person slip through the cracks? You know, how did they get a firearm? What was the circumstances? We think about the Parkland shooting. That young man had interfaced with the law enforcement, 20 plus times. Law enforcement need a legal tool. They need the legal authority to be able to disarm someone. And right now in Virginia specifically, and in many states, they don't have that ability. And you think about it, a person who has been adjudicated mentally ill, and that's a very high standard, as it should be. It's someone who is exhibiting very imminent dangerous signs. That's a prohibitor for gun violence and for a possession of a firearm. But there are many other cases of crisis, you know, in this landscape that also ought to be a situation where you disarm a person. Hate, brandishing, you know, hurting and maiming animals, you know, just you're upset at a divorce, or you're grieving, or abusing alcohol, abusing drugs. None of those rise to the level, you know, of a dangerous mental health adjudication, but they are all indicative of dangerous behaviors. A history of violence is the single biggest predictor of future violence. So we, you know, put a bunch of academics in the room and say, what do we do about this? And they said, let's model, you know, some protective orders along the same judicial process as domestic violence protective orders, and let's temporarily disarm this person. Let's save their life. They may be at risk of harm to self. They may be at risk of harm to others. And these laws, as Rabbi said, are working. They've passed in 17 states. We know that they're being applied very carefully. Many are denied. They might get, I think it was 1,200 petitions in Florida and 700 were issued, somewhere in there. So, you know, they're not being abused, you know. So it is another tool for a community, a law enforcement, and frankly, a family member. We know best when a loved one is in crisis, you know, and we can now go, and hopefully soon in Virginia, we can go to a law enforcement officer or a commonwealth's attorney and say, we need help. Our loved one needs help. Otherwise, there's nothing you can do about it. And should we go to questions? I see two in the audience, but you're called as moderator, so.
Can you hold off for just a couple of minutes? We're going to continue the conversation for a few minutes, and I promise you in 12 minutes we will go to Q&A, okay?
Okay.
And I do really appreciate both of you talking about these red flag laws, how important they really are, and how essential they will be in intervening at a moment when a person is putting an entire community or their entire family at risk. Lori, I want to talk a little bit more about strategy, around the strategy of organizing, because that's what so many of you in this room are doing, and it's what's so important to us. And we know that in order to get the work done, we all have to work together. We know the bigger the better, and the stronger the more successful, and that this is an uphill battle. Some of it does depend on election results. It also depends on the work that we're doing every day to talk to legislatures and to bring more people into our coalitions, into our teams. So can you talk about how you have successfully built this in Virginia with both individuals and organizations, both secular and faith-based, and how you've worked together to create the goals and determine the strategy, even sometimes when the partners don't all agree?
Right. So, our perspective on coalition building is not necessarily that we all join in together for a singular goal. Like, okay, everybody on board, we're gonna pass background checks, or everybody on board, we're gonna pass assault weapons ban, or everybody. Our coalition building in Virginia has been a little different. Especially during these many last years when we legitimately knew we weren't gonna pass legislation. The opportunity just wasn't there politically. However, changing culture and changing efforts in your community was available to us. And our coalition building centered around an idea that would generate at the very local level, and then we would support that idea. And I'll share a couple of them, because I know there are many groups that don't work exclusively on legislation or policy or advocacy in that lane or that space. There's a group in Charlottesville. It's led by a minister at a Second Presbyterian Church there. There was a firearm suicide by a UVA grad student in her apartment. And it upset them greatly, and they said, what can we do about it? They have gone to the 3 or 4 largest apartment building owners and asked these landlords to put in their lease agreements, no firearms allowed in our building. Now, how much more granular and specific and local can you get? But think of the effect it has. Now, how many hundreds and thousands of students now live in housing where no firearms are allowed? We know that suicides, most of them are very, very impulsive. And those that are attempted with a firearm are successful between 85 and 90% when you look at the data. Those attempted with pills, 10%. You're saving lives, the needs matter. So think about this Charlottesville group and what they've done. We may never know how many lives they've saved, but they're working on it. There's a church in Mount Vernon that worked on, there's a little shopping, Mount Vernon, Virginia, there's a little shopping area that's smaller, but similar to like a Georgetown. They've got no firearms allowed in all the shops. They want to be able to have family, friends, neighbors, be able to shop in a space that's free from firearms. We have other groups that culturally look at, think about the spaces and places that you frequent. And it's especially true in Virginia. If we were sitting in a hotel in Virginia, and I asked you this question, what's the hotel's policy on firearms? I don't think any of us would know. Maybe we don't know this. I feel a lot safer in DC. They have much stronger guidelines. Yeah. But do you know what I'm saying? Where you eat, do you know what the restaurant policies are? Where you frequent, where you entertain, where you go to a gym. In Charlottesville, someone doing yoga, his or her firearm fell on the ground and spun across the hardwood floor. So there's many things that you can do at the local level. In Roanoke, they wanted the city council to pass some resolutions, and the city council said no. Guess what? They changed the makeup of the city council the next year. So there's many things you can do locally and culturally, especially if you're in a space or place where legislative change is not possible. And coalition building, we have groups that, frankly, the assault weapons ban may be a bridge too far politically for them or for a lot of reasons. And that's okay. That's okay. We have groups that, support some of the domestic violence. The League of Women Voters has an agenda, and they've got 4 or 5 of our policies. We're working on 10 at the state level. But they said, hey, we'll be up front on this one. We'll be up front on the child access. We'll be up front on the domestic violence. We'll be up front on background checks. We can't so much be up front on this one or that one. So it's not an either or in our case. We want to work with people who want to do things community-wide, culturally-wide, legislative or policy. So I think making a space for everyone and making a space for every organization and whatever their priorities are.
Mm-hmm.
And the same is true of the work we do in communities of color.
Yeah,
So.
thank you.
Mm-hmm.
One issue which comes up time and time again is the Second Amendment. And so I'm going to ask this question of Rob. The gun lobby has been very successful at framing the Second Amendment as an unlimited right for everyone to own almost any kind of firearm. And I know you've done so much work on this. How do you refute their arguments so that we can successfully counter this presumption that the Second Amendment offers an unlimited right for gun ownership?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. The gun lobby spent decades perpetuating that theory, and they successfully were able to win a lawsuit in 2008 called the District of Columbia versus Heller, which established that the Second Amendment is an individual right. And importantly, though, it also established a number of policies that would be presumptively constitutional. And so I think my answer really is two parts. The first is that the Second Amendment, like every amendment, is not an unlimited right. And that is a matter of constitutional law, and as a matter of policy debate, no one is advocating for policies that have been ruled to be unconstitutional. We are all advocating for policies that fit well within the confines of the understanding of the Second Amendment. The third thing is that the public opinion is with us. It is truly a minority position that the Second Amendment is an unlimited right. 90% of Americans, 87% of gun owners think we should have a background check on every gun sale. Majority of Americans, 80+% of Americans believe in extreme risk protection orders. So just about every single gun safety policy we're working on is well above 50% support. And so as a matter of constitutional law, it's wrong. It's not unlimited. As a matter of policy, we are clearly within the realm of what is deemed constitutional, and the public is with us. And so my strategy is we really cannot give any ground to this notion or believe that there is validity in this view that there's an unlimited right in this, under the Second Amendment. So part of the work that requires going forward is being very vigilant in the legal cases. Paying attention to which cases are bubbling up, submitting amicus briefs with historical evidence and other assistance for attorneys general, and then also supporting our cities, states, and attorneys general who are actually defending these cases. And so I think that is an issue that we don't give enough credit to attorneys general in particular for, which is they go to court and defend these laws, and they're building the jurisprudence that actually will allow us to keep passing good laws that courts will find to be constitutional.
I know both of you have personally been affected by gun violence. And as I mentioned earlier, Lori, your daughter is a survivor of the Virginia Tech shooting, and Rob, you lost your cousin at a very young age to gun violence. Statistics would also indicate that you're probably not alone in this room in having family members who have been victims of gun violence. And I wonder how the two of you sustain yourselves in this work. I imagine it fires your passion, and I imagine at moments it's emotionally exhausting as well.
I'll speak, very briefly. I often say to audiences, how lucky our family is. Emily's alive. She's doing well. She teaches high school French. I had two lovely, lovely grandchildren. Y'all can call me Nana. And it's not the same for 32 other families from that day. It's just not the same. Their children are forever 19, 20, 21. It's been 7 years since the Sandy Hook shooting. Those parents are looking at middle schoolers, and their child is not. Their child is still 6, frozen in age and in their minds. I think about those families, and I remember clear as day in the car driving from Richmond, Virginia towards Salem, Virginia, with the hospital where they had taken my daughter. And as the radio is news, and we're going 90 miles an hour, literally 90 miles an hour. And every emergency vehicle known to man, anywhere within 150 miles, 200 miles of Blacksburg is passing us, flying down the highway. Every law enforcement agency, every emergency vehicle, and on the radio, the body count's going higher and higher. And I just remember thinking, I couldn't fathom imagining being one of those parents, and I said to my husband, Emily's alive, and other families are making this trip to pick up their dead child. And I cannot fathom that pain, and I will do anything and everything to save some family from that pain. It was just very visceral to have that front row seat and know many of the families. I still stay in touch with many of those families. I can't imagine what Rob and his family and Amanda have gone through. It's just, indescribable. And we know so much of this is preventable. It's preventable. Think about this. Think how these families feel. How many people have died in this coronavirus? What, the count's 800 plus? And how many in a couple of months? Over 700 Americans will die this week. This week. Look at the public health response to that virus, and you've got families, and we're not seeing this at the federal level, at the state, at the local level. I'm horrified. I'm mystified, and I'm disgusted. It's a public health epidemic. When you have policies and programs and tools at your fingertips and you're not taking advantage of them, I find it morally unacceptable. Just on a moral level, that we're not doing more. I find it appalling. Rob can speak to it. States with the strongest gun laws have the fewest gun deaths. States with the weakest gun laws have the highest gun deaths. We know we can do more, and we have an obligation to do more. I'll say that.
I'll be brief so we can get to questions. I think what sustains me is thinking about family and friends and loved ones, and also the recognition that in no way is my story unique, special, or alone. I mean, for my family it is meaningful and impactful, but 58% of Americans know someone who's been impacted by gun violence, either themselves or a close relative. It is a uniquely American experience for us to suffer like this. To suffer at a barrel of a gun that does not belong in the hands of a person who is a danger to themselves or others. And so I think about my aunt and uncle, who for 19 years have worked tirelessly to pass 83 laws in California. I think about the other survivors who have the courage to tell their stories, especially in states and in communities where they're met with armed protesters. And I think about everyone who's come together to build this movement to the point where we really are at this tipping point. And it's no longer are these moments of national action, but we clearly are a movement for gun safety. And being in these rooms, both in DC but across the country, is what sustains me. It's the energy that I feel from people who want to see this change, who are working for this change. It's the survivors who will never let go of their loved one's memory. And it's my belief that I have a little something to add to this movement. And I get to wake up and work on this issue that I care so much about, and I know that I'm privileged, because we don't always have that opportunity. So I think about kind of all of those things probably way too frequently, but it does give me a lot of hope when I look at my 10-year-old and 7-year-old that I know we're making a safer America.
Thank you. I have a question about the power of persuasion. And I don't even think I need to ask it, because I know that all of you in this room felt that persuasive power in the remarks of Rob and Lori, and the way they spoke so passionately about the work and about the strategy. And I would like to now open this up to our audience for questions, and especially those that are really around how to build the ground force in your own community, sir.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, panel. My name is Evan Goldman. I'm from Broward County, Florida. And on February 14th, we will remember the second anniversary of the Parkland shootings. And this is my testimony. Well, what happened was a quintessentially Jewish tragedy. Many of the victims were part of our Jewish community, active even with our federation. But my testimony is that today our community is more divided than it was in the days and weeks after the tragedy. You have family members who are not talking to each other. The school, the administrators, the teachers, the professionals are divided. Politically, as you all know, the state of Florida passed the MSD legislation with many Democrats saying, look, I represent a community of color. There have to be assault weapon bans, and my mother's classroom teachers, and a blessed memory. She wouldn't want any school professionals to carry guns. So my question is, Laura, you've done amazing work in Virginia. You yourself have been touched by tragedy. How do you bring folks together who are experiencing so much emotion?
It's hard. I'm sure you've seen it in these last several years. And that's why I speak to, what's important at the community level. Are there educational events that can be hosted? Data shows us guns do not make you safer. They don't, and I think educational events around what is the data? Where does it lead you? What are the facts? What is the problem? And describe it and stay in a space and a place that's apolitical and that is driven by the public health experts. We just participated in late September in Richmond. We had two of the prominent hospitals in the city, VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University's Medical College of Virginia, and the Bon Secours Hospital, a Catholic hospital. And we had a gun violence symposium in that space. That's as apolitical as they get. So there are things like that, that may work, they may not. But I do think that communities that are directly affected by gun violence do get on a path and a continuum where it's all about protecting the families. It's all about being sensitive to the families. Then moving, maybe over time to a place where more we can now talk about it, and then maybe moving to a place now, well, let's start thinking about it and educating ourselves about it. And eventually I think that communities can get to a place where they're a little more active. Blacksburg, Virginia was very much the same way. It was very, very difficult for people who lived in the city of Blacksburg to feel like they were doing anything that would harm the family's emotional well-being. Whether it was right or wrong could be debated by different perspectives, but they did not want to do anything that would add any more discomfort or pain to the family. So it makes sense to me that the Parkland and the community around there is treading lightly, but moving forward, and hopefully, again, very, very public health driven educational events, I think, could be valuable. They may work, they might not.
Sounds great.
Okay. My name's Cliff Karchmer, and I am a career law enforcement researcher. I'm working on this issue now. I want to drill down just a bit and go back to the red flag extreme violent protection orders. One is a comment observation, the second is a question. First, to drill down to what's going to happen when law enforcement or other organizations start to enforce where those 17 state jurisdictions, they're passed. I think that there is a very small handful of localities where police have responded to problem individuals whose names have been called in as being at risk. And the officers have, whether there is a law or not, persuaded people to give up their handguns. thereby preventing either a third-party assault or suicide. There's not much talk about this. I think this training and so forth, this could really be something that the Second Amendment nuts don't have a problem with. My question is, it's related to this drill down issue. The red flag laws empower police to seek to confiscate guns with a civilly oriented order. It's not a criminal matter, okay? What if the the government agency responding to the problem, person or family, were either a member of a team who is with EMS, or a mental health professional who is part of a team and who who musters when there is a problem, to seek to address the problem that person has for their well-being, rather than going to the home to get the gun away from that person, which triggers and inflames the Second Amendment people. I mean, why can't we nullify or mitigate that situation? And again, in Charlotte, there is a Tom Hemert's program, which is the one in the country that I know of, uses a crisis intervention team to do that. So let me leave it at this. These are just suggestions for things that can help people if they are in jurisdictions with very severe Second Amendment opposition to
Great.
this.
Lori, you want to start with that?
Yeah, so we have worked with law enforcement extensively in our organization, traveling the country, to become more informed about their needs. What do they need to implement these laws? And I think you're exactly correct. Crisis intervention training, CIT, for law enforcement agencies across the board have proved to be effective at intervening, not just with regard to firearm ownership, but with regard to arresting people who are in a crisis. They're not necessarily a criminal, and they're, maybe they're on the edge of breaking the law, but they're not because they have criminal intent or civil intent. They're in crisis. They're having some sort of breakdown. So I applaud you in that, thinking in that direction, and that law enforcement need to be more aware.
Yeah, but Lori, excuse me, what about not sending a law enforcement
So
person?
in many of the states, the order is issued and the person can voluntarily turn in their firearms. It's not a knock on the door.
Okay.
Okay? Some states, when the civil order is issued, a search warrant is issued at the same time. Different states have set up that process differently, and we're listening loud and clear to law enforcement as to what process works best and is handled best to preclude that confrontation. We don't want it to be confrontational at all. The premise and purpose of an extreme risk protective order is protection. That's in the word. It's what we want for the person who is suffering. So a lot of times family members are that intervening, person versus immediately going to law enforcement. And we're still learning. We're still learning best practices and best methods.
So it's a good question. It's a great question, Cliff. And we've pulled data from the states that have these laws on the books. Some have had them for quite a long time. Yes. Indiana passed their law in 2005, Connecticut in 1999. From January 2018 to August 2019, we've seen about 4,000 petitions be filed. So I think that's an important number when you think about nationally.
Yeah, totally.
And we don't have data from every state, but in a report that it's available through your app that I put up there, you can see the state-by-state breakdown. So it gives a sense of what is really the scope of these orders that we're talking about. To drill into your point though of confrontation, the way these laws are written is when you go to get an order, a final order, there's due process built in. And so the person who the order is taken out against has the ability to show up at the hearing, to contest the order, and as Lori said, a process to turn in the guns. And so through that outlet, you actually you're creating a way so it's not a knock on the door, and it's not a kind of in-the-moment confrontation. These laws do have processes built into them that allow for emergency orders. If you can prove to a judge that truly the threat is imminent, of either self-harm or of mass violence, then you can get a temporary order that lasts between 7 and 14 days where the police will show up and try to get those firearms. But that is a very heightened standard, and it requires a threat of imminence. In general though, these orders are meant to have due process, which allows for the diffusion of this tension. And the law enforcement officers that I've spoken to and we've worked with across the country, they really are very thoughtful about both the process for filing these orders, but also the process for recovering firearms and then returning them. Because as you said, this is temporary and it's a civil order, and so it will expire. It could expire as soon as the crisis is over and the person then moves to cancel it, or at the end of a time period. And that's really an important part of how these laws are designed and implemented, is not just getting the petition, but seeing it through.
Thank you, Bill.
One more, we have
One more
time for one
question.
more question, and I'd like that question to be really specific to organizing efforts that you may be leading in your state and need help with, or have a question about.
Well, I can tell you what we're doing in my state, or at least in part of my state, but I do have a question that's related to something else, but I'm just gonna go for it. So, my name is Linda Scherzer. I'm director of the CRC in Greater Metro West New Jersey, the largest Jewish federation in the state of New Jersey. I'm incredibly proud that our state has some of the strongest gun safety laws in the nation. My federation, my CRC, has been actively involved with our teens in lobbying for common sense gun legislation. We've gone with them to Trenton, our state capital. We've gone to Washington. We're now looking to partner with African American teens who deal with gun violence on a routine basis particularly in Newark, inner cities like Newark. But you know, I find it astounding when I hear you talk about the coalitions that you've built in Virginia, but on the issue of assault weapons, that you don't always, you can't find everyone coming to the table. I just, you know, I'm curious as to what is the reasoning? Why do people feel so protective of weapons that are military weapons that are used on battlefields, that they feel this should be, you know, a right under the Second Amendment?
Yeah, I'll try to answer real quickly, but I'm curious to hear Rob's take on it. You know, these gun ownership in the country used to be about a little over 50% of households had firearms. Now we're down to about 32% of households have firearms. So the number of owners is shrinking. So think about it. They're trying to increase their market. They're trying to continue to sell firearms. My husband owns a hunting rifle that was his grandfather's. He has no intention of ever buying another one, but he's one of those gun owners that, you know, doesn't need it. They're hardware, they're metal, they never expire. So the gun industry is always looking for new ways to sell more and more and more hardware, more accessories, more power. And so they fostered and purposely went out to sell sporting rifles. And they have gone legally to call them in common use, because that's what was the language that was used in the Heller case. So in Virginia, and the pushback on the assault weapons ban that we're trying to move right now, I just got a text from Secretary of Public Safety, Brian Moran, as we're sitting here. The other side is these are common use, these are in common use, these are in common use. We have got to deflect that and continue, in my opinion, to call them weapons of war. That's, you know, they're not meant. Whether they're in common use can be debated. I need a legal expert to push back on that. So the other thing that is just such a big pill for the other side to swallow is the fact that they're banned. They think they should be allowed to own any firearm, anywhere, anyhow, with little to no restrictions. And we just disagree. These weapons increase the lethality of mass shootings, and they are also part of the increase in the frequency of mass shootings we've had. The ban between 94 and 04, there's some data behind that it worked. It's inexplicable to me.
Are they
On
actually,
some level.
Are they actually using these weapons? These that can fire
I
off
think
multiple
they use them, they're fun to shoot, I was
Mhm.
told. They're fun. And I'm just like, at what point do we as a people in a society give up on the notion that the convenience or the fun of something is valued less than the lives of our neighbors and our citizens and our communities? I don't get that imbalance. I really don't. I just don't understand that.
And I think we're at time, but I'll be very brief. Linda's a very good question. The truth is there's tens of millions of these weapons in circulation. To the legal question, that no court has ever found that prohibitions or bans are unconstitutional. So yet again, this goes to your earlier point, Lori, about kind of this myth of an unlimited Second Amendment right is just that. Courts have routinely said that these types of restrictions are constitutional, but there's a lot of heat in this particular issue, and the other side will, as we saw in Virginia, Lori lived through this, and her bravery showed up. Tens of thousands of people, or 22,000 people came, many over 10,000 carrying their AR-15s with high-capacity magazines to basically say you're not going to take these. And so for all the policies that we work on, this policy, while it is constitutional, I would say it does bring the most heat from the other side because it is a prohibition of all types of weapons rather than an intervention like background checks or extreme risk. And I hope that starts to kind of answer your question of like why does that issue have so much more dynamic around it than maybe other ones.
I'm sorry that we have to end here. I think this was such an illuminating conversation. Rarely do we have this kind of expertise in the room. I want everyone to really think about how the conversation today can lead to your inspired action in your communities. I didn't get a chance to talk as much about the work that JWI is doing, but you all have a flyer and there'll be
There's some more right here
materials
if you
in
need.
your, yeah, in there, there'll be more materials online. So you can read about really specific things like reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act with the boyfriend loophole fixed. Rob and Lori, I can't thank you enough. And if anyone has any